Welcome to Masters of Product Management, a show that gives you real-world techniques and cutting-edge strategies to learn, apply, and succeed in product management. Now, here's the master himself, Steven Haines.
Welcome back, everyone. From my point of view, and I'm probably not saying anything you don't already know about, people in product organizations are using rapid application development techniques. They're using rapid design. They're trying to get customer validation. And a lot of this just goes hand in hand with the overall push to do things faster and more efficiently, and really to just get the customer validation on designs as soon as possible so that you can make sure that you're delivering the right value proposition to the right customer. It's as simple as that. And the way I see this, it's also a vital part of this continuous learning process. And so that this is the model that you use once your products are released to market, that you're able to continuously get feedback and fine-tune to continuously deliver, again, on that customer value proposition. From my point of view, there are lots of opportunities, but a huge number of challenges in this iterative design, which is the reason I want this show to really make a couple of points with some expertise from the field. And so today I'm speaking with Dave Zasada, he and I have been speaking for many months on this topic. And he's got tremendous street cred. He was the recently Senior VP of Product Management at ACT, where he designed and implemented their entire product management process, their team, their strategy, and so on. And he's been involved in executive product management positions in a bunch of different companies across his career. And the way Dave says, he's been responsible for developing and managing over 1,000 products across a bunch of categories. So my kind of man. And well, Dave, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Stephen. I appreciate it.
It's great. Hey, listen, for the people who are listening in, could you just explain the idea behind these design sprints that you and I have been talking about and why they're just so important?
Sure. Well, at a high level, a design sprint's a flexible problem-solving framework that's time-boxed. Ultimately increases the chances of making something people actually want. And a design sprint framework really originated out of Google Ventures, but it's now being used by many companies. And what I like about it is it can really be customized based on your own goals. A typical design sprint's broken down into 5 phases, and each phase can be completed in about a day or so. So the entire sprint might last about a week. And, I said 5 phases, and those phases include understand, diverge, converge, build, and test. And first, you really focus on understanding the problem that you're really trying to solve. And then you diverge and ultimately come up with a lot of different ideas on how you might solve that particular problem. And then when you move into the converge stage, you ultimately select a small number of the ideas that you want to prototype and build and ultimately test with individuals who actually have the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, can I interrupt for a second? Because I got a nail and I really have to focus in on this point. It is vital to really make the connection between the customer's problem and what you're testing. Because if you're trying to validate something with the customer who's not having that particular problem, then you're going to be off, right? And have you experienced that before?
I have. The quality of the data that you get back once you get to the test phase is really suspect if you're not actually finding individuals to share the prototype with that don't have the actual problem that you're trying to solve. That really is a challenge to ultimately find the right people to be able to test the prototype with.
That must be really hard. I mean, how do you, I know customers and customers are busy. I'm assuming we're talking about B2B type customers. How do you find these people?
Yeah, really, whether they're B2B or B2C, we tend to use a panel kind of a process. So we try to pre-screen and develop a list of potential candidates that we can call upon when needed in order to bring them in to be a part of a focus group and where we can run prototypes by them. We spend a lot of time up front preparing for that. And sometimes, quite frankly, because you're not really ever 100% sure how a sprint is going to run, you can always end up someplace a little differently than where you started. So you may find that after you complete the first few days of the sprint and you've gotten really tight in terms of the problem you're trying to solve and potential ideas that solve that problem, you may have to take a step back and rethink who you are going to bring in to share the prototypes with. So that's why I say a sprint typically lasts about 5 days, and it may not always run 5 consecutive days. You may run a few days in a row and then break and then have to recruit, and then you might come back even a week later and then wrap up the last couple of days.
Mm. So I'm just curious, like what's in it for the person who's on your panel? They're busy.
Sure. But they typically, the type of people that we recruit, certainly in my category or primary category, which is education, that tend to have, just a vested interest in trying to improve, the quality of education. So whether we're bringing in parents or students or guidance counselors or teachers or administrators, they tend to want to give their opinion and be a part of the process. And they actually kind of appreciate and feel flattered to be asked. So we typically don't have a big issue with recruitment. It's just finding the right people.
Yeah, I'd like to be one. I'm totally opinionated, But anyway, I do digress. So talk to me a little bit about the environment and, how do you get leadership to support this stuff? And how do you get the product managers to make sure it's done right? Describe a little bit about these protocols and these procedures.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of questions kind of in there. The first, as it relates to the environment, is actually an important one because the environment in which you run the sprint needs to be conducive to allow a lot of ideation. You do a number of different activities that you do in kind of small groups. They're collaborative. You do a lot of drawing, and it's a process where you end up putting a lot of things up on the wall. So you need a lot of wall space or whiteboard space, and you really need to have a dedicated space that you can leave all these different artifacts up until the sprint is complete. Because it's really disruptive to have to try to take it all down, move it someplace else, kind of figure where you left off, et cetera. So from an environment perspective, that's important. Now, from a leadership perspective, I believe that that's actually even probably more important. I find it's really helpful if leadership understands and supports and ultimately trusts the process that you're going through. If you can convince leadership to invest the time to participate in a sprint, even an abbreviated sprint, if you do one even quicker than 5 days, that's really the best. But if you can't do that, even getting them to at least come and visit the room where the sprint's being held at the end of each day or at the end of the sprint and kind of walk the wall and kind of see all the artifacts, which ultimately end up telling a story, then that works out really well.
Masters of Product Management is brought to you by Sequent Learning Networks, real tools for success in product management, strategy, and marketing. Find out more at sequentlearning.com. That's sequentlearning.com.
Product managers are busy. How do they design the session? I hear about the wall space and the environment, but it seems to be that it would be taking a lot of time. So in the overall scheme of things, how much time, like on a percentage basis, would a product manager be spending doing this work, planning and organizing it and then tallying the results and then incorporating some of that feedback into the product?
Yeah, there is time that you need to devote up front to really plan, recruit the right people to be part of the sprint, because you want the participants in the sprint to be kind of a cross-functional group within the organization. So you don't necessarily just want product people. It's best if you have other key stakeholders from the organization or actually invite in some customers to participate so you get multiple opinions and perspectives. So they have to do a little bit of work up front to kind of think about who they're going to invite to the sprint and kind of get it scheduled. And then usually there's a little bit of work up front to do some research on the problem that you're going to attack. And then on the back end, you typically will put together a sprint retrospective. And that takes a little bit of time just to kind of summarize everything that took place in the sprint and then share it out with the group.
So how many design sprints, this is sort of some benchmarking, how many could be done in a given, let's say in a month or in a year? What's that number?
It depends on the number of individuals you have that are able and willing to participate in the sprint. It's hard if you're going to use the same core group of people to do every sprint within your organization. There is a commitment of time that's required in order to actually do the sprint. And so, if you're doing it with the same group of people, you're probably only going to get a sprint done once every month or maybe 2 months. If you're a sprint facilitator and you have a different group that comes in and out of the different sprints, that might vary perhaps because of the problem that you're trying to solve, you can do them more frequently than that. You could do a couple a month and the facilitator could handle that.
Is there a difference between a design sprint and just like a regular sprint during Agile development?
Yeah, they're very different processes. And, design sprint's more of an ideation process, where the sprint kind of in the agile process is more about actually developing. So the benefit of doing the design sprint is you get really clear up front in terms of what it is you're actually trying to build based on the problem that you're trying to solve. And in a very quick and iterative way, you're validating it for desirability. So before you start investing all the resources required to develop something, you've already de-risked it by going through this process.
Sure. What's the documentation you produce? I mean, in the old days, we'd produce a PRD. What do you produce as a result of the design sprint?
Yeah, so there's a sprint retrospective that kind of summarizes, here's what the problem was that we were trying to solve. Here are some ideas that we came up with that ultimately could solve that problem. You summarize the prototypes that you put together and the customer feedback, and then you summarize the results of those tests.
Okay. When I heard you say that before, I was trying to figure out how, what do we actually write down and what artifacts do we leave? Have you ever found this situation where the segment that you were targeting was different than your hypothesis?
Yeah.
And do you have a story to tell about that?
As I mentioned earlier, it's not uncommon that you end at a different place than you thought you would when you started. So I'm actually running a design sprint right now with a group of high school kids. We're doing it as part of their entrepreneurship class that they run. They have a virtual business that they create and run, and like many real companies, they started with just jumping to a solution. So we want to create this without really thinking about what's the problem I'm going to solve with that, and is this the right idea to solve that problem. So we're introducing the design sprint process with this class of high school kids, and one of the problems they were trying to solve had to do with kind of in a sports theme, kind of coming up with customization of sports equipment. And so it started there, and through the design sprint process, they actually ended someplace very differently and ended up their persona that they focused on wasn't necessarily an athlete or even a parent. It was the booster club and the challenges a booster club has in raising money. So we started the sprint thinking we were going to ultimately, when it came time for focus groups, bring in athletes or parents, and it shifted during the sprint itself as we got more clear on the ideas and the problem to being booster club participants.
That's really cool. So as we wind this down, what's the best advice that you would offer product managers and others to really embrace and deploy this design sprint technique?
Yeah, so probably the best advice I could give is to make sure when you go into the sprint, you have a willingness to be flexible, because again, no design sprint's the same. If you go in thinking already up front, this is how it's going to run, this is the solution that I want to come out with, then you're really just kind of really setting yourself up for failure as it relates to the sprint and not taking advantage of the value you can get out of a sprint. You also need to really select a good facilitator, and that's important in order to kind of be able to keep the group on task. You need to be okay with the fact that you don't want to be overly self-critical. So a lot of the activities that you do during design sprint involve doing some drawing and brainstorming, et cetera. And sometimes individuals can get self-conscious over, oh, my drawing isn't very good, or this is a silly idea or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's all part of the process. You want to have as many crazy ideas as you can, because ultimately at the end of the day, you need a lot of ideas in order to come up with one or two that are really good. So that's some of the advice I would give.
This reminds me, we as product guys are really the ultimate in practitioners, right? We learn by doing this stuff. And I'm sure that the first time that anybody is doing this kind of work, it's a little bit rocky. But I guess if you're implementing it over a period of time, you're creating a collective perspective on customers. And you're also creating a collective perspective on the needs and motivations as those customers evolve and move through their own life cycles. And I think it's a really, really important way to look at this. And the reason I think this is also so critical is that in the research that we do in my company, Sequent Learning Networks, it really focuses on that we don't fully understand what a customer needs and when a customer needs it. And the reason is it's clear to us that customer types they're mistargeted. We have broad segments, but we really don't understand, it's been said in some publications, the jobs that customers actually have to do when those customers have to do those jobs. And this gives us a perfect opportunity to really get in there and validate this stuff so that we can make the best use of our company's resources. And Dave, this has been a tremendously powerful talk. And I hope that in the short period of time we have, that we've been able to at least inspire product people who are listening in to try to adapt this technique regardless of the industry in which they operate. So thank you very much for being on the show, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. So I hope that you, as listeners, really were able to benefit from this. And I hope you'll join me again next time on Masters of Product Management. See you next time.
Looking for resources and best practices in product management? Just go to Sequent Learning Networks to gain access to real-world tools that can make a difference. It's all there at sequentlearning.com.